Romantic Tales. Chapter 431. In the dim dungeon, Emo Xiuyao sat on a chair and lazily looked at the middle-aged man who was tied to a wooden stake and covered in blood. He raised his eyebrows and smiled. Deputy Commander of the Imperial Guards? The Emperor's trusted aide and favorite general Xue Qingliang? And the Empress Dowager's nephew, the Emperor's cousin? Emo Jingqi is really willing to spend a lot of money to send you to the northwest? The man raised his head and looked at the man in white with white hair. His eyes flashed with a trace of panic. In a dark and dirty place like the dungeon, this kind of white color made people's heart feel even more cold. Emo Xiuyao didn't care and smiled indifferently. I heard that Commander Xue is known as the #1 expert in the palace and your martial arts are only slightly worse than Mu Qingsang's. After so many years, you've only been a deputy commander of the Imperial Guards. It's really a waste of talent. Xue Qingliang suddenly raised his head. He didn't have any fame in the capital and had been an unremarkable deputy commander of the Imperial Guards for so many years. He didn't expect Emo Xiuyao to have investigated him so thoroughly. Emo Xiuyao leaned back in his chair and looked at him from the corner of his eyes. After entering my Riyang city, Commander Xue shouldn't be thinking that you can safely leave, right? I won't let people torture you. I reckon that torture is useless to you. Do you plan to say it yourself or do you want I to think of a way to make you say it? Xue Qingliang sneered. Does Riyang city belong to the prince? Does this world belong to the king? Does the king think that Riyang is yours just because you've occupied it? I really didn't expect that the Ding imperial residence would produce a rebel. I don't know if Emo Lanyun and Emo Lufang will be able to face the great ancestor and the late emperor in the underworld. Emo Xiuyao didn't care about his cursing. His eyes were as cold as snow. I didn't expect Commander Xue to be such a loyal and patriotic person. I really admire him. However, I don't know if Commander Xue's confidant and the young master who was born not long ago are also loyal and patriotic people? Xue Qingliang was stunned and a trace of panic appeared in his eyes. Only now did he truly believe that Emo Xiuyao had investigated his identity thoroughly. If Emo Xiuyao had used his family to threaten him, he might not have cared. However, he was the son of a concubine of the Xue family, and the head of the Xue family was the sister of the Empress Dowager. He had suffered a lot since he was young. He had no feelings for the Xue family, including his wife. But the confidant and newborn child mentioned by Emo Xiuyao were indeed his favorite. She was his childhood sweetheart, the first woman he loved in this life. She had accompanied him through the most difficult times of those years, and now they had a son. Originally, he had already planned to ask the emperor for an imperial decree after returning home, so that he could openly welcome her and their child back home as his wives. Seeing Xue Qingliang's expression change, Emo Xiuyao smiled in satisfaction and raised his hand to move his fingers. Behind him, Qin Feng took out a portrait and unfolded it before handing it to Xue Qingliang. Xue Qingliang's originally green face immediately paled. The people in the portrait were his sweetheart and his son. Not to mention their appearance, even the courtyard in the background was exactly the same. Xue Qingliang exclaimed in shock, "That's impossible. How could you?" Emo Xiuyao's smile was cold and emotionless. I truly didn't know that Commander Xue would grace the Northwest with his presence. But I never said that I would never return to the Chu capital. Since that's the case, we naturally need to properly investigate what kind of people are at His Majesty's side. Ever since the incident with Tan Jiji, Emo Xiuyao had ordered Tianyi Pavilion and the Shadow Guard to thoroughly investigate Emo Jingqi's side. Although they couldn't be certain that they had uncovered all of Emo Jingqi's hidden pawns, they had still gained some results. "What do you want?" Xue Qingliang asked in a hoarse voice. Emo Xiuyao stood up and said, "Commander Xue has been at His Majesty's side since he was 15, so you must know a lot. Don't worry, you can slowly think about it. In less than a month, I guarantee that Commander Xue's family will be reunited. At that time, it won't be too late for Commander Xue to slowly consider what answer to give." After saying this, Emo Xiuyao no longer paid any attention to Xue Qingliang, who was tied to a pillar and covered in blood. He turned and walked out of the prison cell. Behind him, Xue Qingliang roared angrily, "Emo Xiuyao, you're not allowed to hurt them." "Oh right, Commander Xue, please don't think of committing suicide or anything stupid. I don't have a rule of not killing women and children, or do you want your son to suffer in your place?" "Emo Xiuyao, you'll die a horrible death." Xue Qingliang looked at the man in front of him with white robes and hair as white as snow. as if he was looking at a demon or a ghost. Die a horrible death. Emo Shuyao snorted. I have already died more than 10 times. I may not be afraid of death, but Commander Shui, are you afraid? Shui Qingliang was speechless. Was he afraid of death? Of course he was. He had suffered countless hardships since he was young, and now that he finally had his own family and his own child, how could he not be afraid of death? Suja woke up 5 days after De Wang and Yu Wang left. Hearing Emo Shuyao say that the second king had already left with his men, Suja was stunned for a moment. He looked at Emo Shuyao and shook his head. Why is your highness doing this? Emo Shuyao was silent for a moment before saying, Elder Su's body can no longer withstand the long journey. If Elder Su insists on returning, he will have to wait until his body fully recovers. If Elder Su does not wish to live in Ryong City, there is a courtyard outside the city for Elder Su to stay temporarily. Suja sighed, shook his head and did not say anything more. He only lived alone in the quiet courtyard of the prince's mansion to recuperate. He read books and rarely left the house. He also did not ask about Su Zuidi's matters. When the child was 9 months old, a piece of news suddenly spread throughout the various countries. It was said that the previous dynasty's Emperor Gaozu's treasure and the imperial jade seal were in the northwest. The previous dynasty's Emperor Gaozu was considered to be an even more legendary figure than the Dechu state's great ancestor. It was said that he had once obtained the Golden City's treasure, which was only recorded in unofficial history. It was said that it was a city built with gold. It could be imagined how rich the Emperor Gaozu's family was if this rumor was true. Not to mention the imperial jade seal that caused the nobles of the various countries to scramble for it. As soon as this news came out, there were immediately signs of various people moving about in the northwest, causing the originally calm situation in the northwest to immediately become tense. Yili's belly was getting bigger and bigger. After 9 months, the child could be born at any time. Emo Shuyao had already sent people to choose servants and midwives to stay in the mansion at any time. Not only that, but because Yili had always disliked other people serving her, Emo Shuyao specially sent people to bring over the people by Yili's side that were originally in the Chu capital. Seeing that Chief Steward Emo had been transferred to the northwest, leaving the Central Plains affairs unattended, Feng Jiao repeatedly cursed and sent a letter to Leng Haoyu to have him temporarily take over the Central Plains affairs. Qin Feng, who went to pick up the people, arrived in Ryong City at almost the same time as the news of the previous dynasty's treasure. Emo Xiuyao, who had originally been accompanying Yili to relax, received the news from Zhuojing. His expression darkened and he coldly said, Tan Jiji, you really are in a hurry to die. Yili took the letter and glanced at it. She nudged Emo Xiuyao and said, hurry and go take care of it. Feng San and the others are definitely waiting. Emo Xiuyao sighed softly and gently said, I'll be right back. You don't have to worry too much. Yili smiled and nodded. She watched as Emo Xiuyao left. Only then did she turn around to look at the people at the side and said with a faint smile, Nanny Mother Lin, are you all well? Although Mother Lin and the wet nurse were reluctant to part, they were indeed not young anymore. The bumpy journey was indeed not light. They could only let the servants take them to rest. The young Yahuan also had tired expressions, but their spirits were unusually good. They surrounded Yili and chattered endlessly with curiosity and joy. With great difficulty, Yili finally managed to calm them down and let the servants take them to rest. Seeing the hall quiet down again, Yili smiled and said to Qin Feng, who was standing at the side, It hasn't been so lively in a long time. I'm not used to it. Qin Feng smiled faintly and said, Wang Fei doesn't like people to serve her, and the people by her side don't dare to disturb Wang Fei. But these girls have been with Wang Fei for a long time and are very close to Wang Fei. Yili nodded and changed her mind to ask about proper matters. On the way back, did you hear any news? Qin Feng nodded and said, when we were close to the northwest, we did hear some rumors. But we didn't take the official roads on the way back, so there wasn't any important news. It's just that the news of the previous dynasty's treasure may have first spread from the capital, but it didn't come from the capital. Yili nodded. Qin Feng and the others hadn't been slow on the way back. When he left the capital, he hadn't heard the news, but when he arrived in the northwest, it had already spread to the entire world. This news naturally didn't come from the capital. There were probably people secretly spreading it everywhere. Snorting softly, Yili sneered and said, "The prince is right. Tanjiji is indeed in a hurry to die." The baby in Yili's stomach seemed to have sensed its mother's anger. Yili only felt 2 kicks in her stomach. She frowned and smiled helplessly as she reached out to comfort the baby. This child was very lively even in the womb. It would definitely be a mischievous little brat in the future. Qin Feng looked awkwardly at Yili. He wanted to say something but stopped. Yili smiled at him and said, "If you have something to say, just say it." "Is Commander Qin shy?" Qin Feng's handsome face reddened slightly. Yili smiled in surprise and said, "Could it be that I guessed correctly? Has Commander Qin encountered some luck with women this time?" Qin Feng smiled helplessly and said, "Princess, don't tease this subordinate. It's just that this subordinate saved someone on the road and brought her back to Ryong without princess permission. Princess, please punish me." "Saved someone? Could it be an old acquaintance?" Yili asked with a raised brow. Qin Feng nodded and said, "It's Miss Yaoji. Does Princess still remember?" Of course Yili remembered. Holding her stomach and sitting steadily, Yili asked, "What happened? Tell me from the beginning." Only then did Qin Feng tell her everything from the beginning. It turned out that after Qin Feng picked up Director Mo's group, he took them to avoid the official roads and traveled day and night. However, they encountered Yaoji, who was being chased outside a small town more than 300 li away from the capital. It was not exactly a chase. At that time, Yaoji was fiercely protecting a child. The other party probably wanted to snatch the child. However, Yaoji resisted desperately and finally angered the other party, so they wanted to kill her and snatch the child. Qin Feng had seen Yaoji a few times. Naturally, he could not leave her in the lurch. Therefore, he defeated the group of people and rescued Yaoji. However, Yaoji's appearance was too outstanding. Now that there were wars everywhere, they had nowhere to go with the child. Therefore, Qin Feng brought her back. Yili smiled and said, "What did I do at that time? Did you send someone to investigate Yaoji?" Qin Feng nodded and said, "That day I ordered the shadow guard to investigate. There was nothing suspicious." Yili nodded and said, "You have always been reliable. Yaoji is also an old acquaintance, so you brought her back. But have you thought about how to settle her down?" Qin Feng was a little distressed. He only cared about rescuing her. When did he think about how to settle her down? Yili covered her mouth and smiled. Yaoji must have fled in panic when being chased. Otherwise, with her ability, she would not be so embarrassed. If she had some money and property, it would be fine to find a place for her to live and make a living in the city. But look at her. When I rescued her, I saw that her clothes were old and she was thin. I am afraid she did not have much money. Qin Feng suddenly understood. He nodded and said, "Thank you for your advice, Wang Fei. I understand. I will find a place for her to settle down later. I also have some savings. There is no harm in giving her some for temporary use." Yili wished she could knock Qin Feng's wooden head. She rolled her eyes at him and said, "She is a single woman with a child. How can she accept your money? Although she used to be a prostitute, now that she has a child, how can she not consider the child? It is not easy to stay here. Naturally, she will not go back to her old job. Does she still want her reputation?" Unless Qin Feng planned to marry her, it was better not to be too solicitous. Qin Feng was a little dispirited. He looked at Yili helplessly. He could not give her money, but he also could not refuse. How could saving someone be more troublesome than going to the battlefield? Chapter 433. Yili sighed and said, "Ask Miss Yaoji to come. Maybe she already has a plan." Yaoji was not one of those girls who had no opinions. Even though they had only met a few times and Yili did not agree with some of her actions, it did not prevent her from appreciating Yaoji's uniqueness. Qin Feng sighed in relief. It was good that Wang Fei was willing to intervene. He really did not know how to deal with Yaoji. "Thank you, Wang Fei." A short while later, Yaoji was brought in by the guards outside. Seeing the thin and pale woman in front of her, Yili could not help but sigh inside. The Yaoji in front of her was like a different person compared to the sad and stubborn woman from a year ago who was still radiant. The originally delicate face and snow-white skin appeared thin and sallow due to the adverse effects for a long time. One could only vaguely see the former beauty from the beautiful outline. Her beautiful hair was only casually tied with a cloth, and the yellow and dry hair hung down behind her back. Yaoji was holding a swaddling cloth in her hands. The child looked well taken care of. It was about 5 or 6 months old. She waved her hand to indicate Qin Feng to leave first. Qin Feng looked hesitantly at Yaoji and frowned slightly. Even though the matter of Yaoji had been investigated, Wang Fei was now at a very critical time. There could not be any mistakes. Thinking of this, Qin Feng regretted disturbing Wang Fei with this matter at this time. He only thought that he had to report to Wang Fei that he had rescued Yaoji without permission and brought her back. But he forgot that Wang Fei was about to give birth. As long as nothing happened to Yaoji, it was okay to report later. Seeing Qin Feng hesitate, Yili smiled faintly and said, "You go out first. I want to talk to Miss Yaoji." Qin Feng could only retreat outside the door and wait. Yili smiled apologetically at Yaoji and said, "Sorry for the embarrassment." Yaoji shook her head and smiled faintly. Qin Darren is so loyal to Wang Fei, it really makes one envious. Yili looked at the child in Yaoji's arms. From time to time, Yaoji lowered her head to look at him and rocked gently. Her sickly face was full of love. This child. Yaoji held the child tightly in her arms and said softly, "This is my child. He's almost half a year old. His name is Xin Jingyan. Do you think my name is good?" Yili nodded and said, "Will the child follow your surname?" Yili seemed to remember that Yaoji once mentioned that her original surname was Shen, and her name was Shen Yao. Yaoji seemed to think of something and nodded silently. Looking at the originally peerless beauty in front of her now in such a sorry state, Yili's heart was filled with regret. "I remember that you had a lot of money when you left the capital. How did you end up in such a state?" Qingqing Lane was secretly sold to Yili. The money obtained was definitely enough for Yaoji and the child to live a life of luxury. Yaoji smiled bitterly and gently stroked the sleeping child, saying, "Yaoji is conceited and doesn't lose to anyone. But after leaving Qingqing Lane, I realized that other than singing and dancing, I don't know anything else. Although I hate the identity of a courtesan, this identity has allowed me to live freely these years. Otherwise, I'm afraid that I would have been bought back to be a concubine. Originally, I thought that although Muyang and I couldn't have a happy ending, at least we could part on good terms." Originally, after Yaoji left the capital because she was already 3 months pregnant, she could only find a remote place near the capital to stay and wait for the child to be born before she set off for the future to start anew. Unexpectedly, several villages near the town where she temporarily lived belonged to Marquis Muyang's family. Among them, a steward recognized Yaoji's identity and reported it to Marquis Muyang. At that time, Yaoji's belly was already 6 months pregnant. Muyang was following Yili to fight in the northwest and hadn't returned. Although Marquis Muyang looked down on Yaoji's identity, at that time the war in the northwest was a crisis. Marquis Muyang was afraid that something might happen to her son, so she didn't want to abort Yaoji's child. She just asked her family to keep an eye on Yaoji. With Yaoji's intelligence, how could she not guess that no matter whether Muyang could come back or not, the day the child was born would be the day she died. So she had to bribe the guards with her money and wait for an opportunity to escape, but she was caught and brought back. Marquis Muyang's family took all of Yaoji's money and didn't leave her even half a copper coin. When they came back, Yaoji was about to give birth. Fortunately, the woman in charge of taking care of Yaoji was soft-hearted and secretly reported to Muyang. When Muyang arrived, it was the day Yaoji gave birth. If Muyang didn't come quickly and break into the delivery room, Yaoji would have died of a hemorrhage that day. After that, because of Muyang's insistence, Yaoji and the child were settled in a courtyard in Marquis Muyang's mansion. Then Muyang married Miss Sunday. Yaoji rested for a few days. When Muyang came to see her and the child, she asked Marquis Muyang's mansion to return her money and then she would leave with the child. But Muyang didn't agree no matter what, and Marquis Muyang's family didn't admit that they took Yaoji's money at all. Yaoji was so angry that she almost fainted. She had saved up for so many years and Yili didn't treat her badly when she sold Qingqing Lane. Not counting the jewelry and treasures, only the banknotes were worth more than 200,000 taels. In order to prevent Yaoji from taking the money and trying to escape, Muyang acquiesced to his maternal family's statement. In this way, Yaoji couldn't even take out half a copper coin, let alone bribing the guards of the courtyard to escape. But Yaoji was stubborn. Every time Muyang went to see her, they always quarreled endlessly. And the behavior of Muyang's frequent visit to the courtyard naturally aroused the suspicion of the new Marquis Muyang. So when Muyang was ordered to go on official business by Marquis Muyang, who was already very dissatisfied with this, Yaoji and the child were almost starved to death in the courtyard. When Muyang came back, he naturally made a big fuss again. Then he took Yaoji and the child to a small courtyard under his name. Yaoji spent more than a month to soften her body and lower Muyang's guard. Then she took advantage of Muyang's drunkenness to escape with the child and a few worthless things and went all the way west. As for the people who chased after her and wanted to steal the child, she didn't know whether they were sent by Muyang or Marquis Muyang's mansion. Looking at Yili, who was still radiant with a big belly in front of her, Yaoji smiled bitterly. If Princess Ding encountered such a thing, she certainly wouldn't be as embarrassed as she was. During the days when she was locked in the courtyard and almost starved to death, Yaoji finally understood that it was simply a daydream to control her own destiny by herself. The reason why she was in the limelight for so many years was just that she had the title of the #1 dancer and Muyang and Feng San secretly protected her. Without these, she was just a useless woman who couldn't move an inch in this world. After listening to Yaoji's story, Yili didn't know whether to sigh or be angry. After pondering for a moment, Yili asked, "What do you plan to do in the future? According to what you said, your money was taken away by Marquis Muyang's mansion. I can ask someone to get it back for you. What do you plan to do in the future?" Yaoji looked down at the child in her arms and raised her head. "Yaoji begs your highness to find a good family to adopt my child. I don't ask for glory and wealth as long as my parents live in harmony." Chapter 434. Yili frowned and asked in confusion, "What are you doing? If you don't want this child, why did you bring him out? If he stays in Marquis Muyang's mansion, Muyang won't mistreat the child because of your relationship." Yaoji smiled bitterly and looked at Yili. "I've heard about Princess's family. Princess, as the legitimate daughter of a noble family, is mistreated by her stepmother. Not to mention my son. Miss Sun wants to kill my son. How much can Muyang care about him? Besides, having a mother who used to be a dancer is not a matter of honor. Yaoji just wants him to be safe and sound for the rest of his life." Yili was a little embarrassed. She lowered her head and thought, "It's not convenient for me to do things now. Why don't you live in Ruyang City now and think about your future plans? If you insist, I'll find a good family for the child." Yaoji was overjoyed and said with tears in her eyes, "Xinyao, thanks, Princess." Although she said it resolutely, she was very reluctant to leave the child she carried for 10 months. Yili gave her more time to think. Although she had made up her mind, it was always good to be with the child for a while. She ordered Qin Feng to take Yaoji out. When Yili was thinking about Yaoji with her head down, Emo Xiuyao strolled in. Seeing Yili frowning, Emo Xiuyao quickly sat beside her and checked, "Why are you unhappy? Are you not feeling well?" Yili shook her head. She leaned in Emo Xiuyao's arms and told him about Yaoji's matter. In the end, she sighed and said, "Muyang has really gone too far this time. Not only to Yaoji but also to the newly married granddaughter. Even if the people who chased Yaoji were sent by Miss Sun, Yili wouldn't be too surprised." Hearing Yili worry so much about other people's business, Emo Xiuyao was displeased. Letting her lean against his chest, he gently stroked her round belly and said, "Let other people take care of these trivial matters. If Lili has the time to worry about these trivial matters, it's better to think about other things." Yili looked up at him with a smile and said, "What are you thinking about? Have you thought of a name for the baby?" Emo Xiuyao frowned. "Is it so troublesome to come up with a name?" Yili's lips twitched. She looked at the jealous man and smiled. "Baby Emo? Are you sure the baby won't blame us for naming him like that?" As long as she thought of a handsome young man or middle-aged man who looked like Emo Xiuyao staring at baby Emo, she couldn't help but laugh. Emo Xiuyao raised his eyebrows and said, "Does he dare?" Yili nodded seriously and said, "Believe me, he really dares. As long as it was a man with such a name, he wouldn't be able to resist offending his superiors." Emo Xiuyao snorted and said, "Then let's call him Emo Xiaobao." Yili rolled her eyes. She decided not to talk about this issue with him for the time being. If this man got angry and insisted on calling the baby Emo Baobao or Emo Xiaobao, she wouldn't be able to compete with him. In any case, there was still time to name the baby before he turned 1 year old. Otherwise, she could ask grandfather and uncle to name him. She calmly changed the topic and asked, "How is the matter of the previous dynasty's treasure? Why did it come back so soon?" Emo Xiuyao casually said, "Wasn't it all Tan Jiji's doing? Did he think he could escape after causing trouble for I?" Yili asked curiously, "What did you do?" Emo Shuyao lightly said, "Of course I told his true identity to our emperor. It was also a show of loyalty to the Dechu state." Yili raised her eyebrows and said, "When Tanjiji left the northwest, he should have been prepared for his identity to be exposed, right?" Emo Shuyao coldly smiled and said, "What if he added the Imperial Jade Seal? Would anyone believe that the Imperial Jade Seal is on him?" Yili asked. "There will be people who will believe it. When we return, send the Shadow Guard to kill Tanjiji. There's no need to kill him. Just make him hand over the Imperial Jade Seal." Emo Shuyao indifferently said. Yili understood and smiled. Even the Ding Palace was chasing after Tanjiji for the Imperial Jade Seal. Then those who were interested in the Imperial Jade Seal would naturally have to think twice. As for who to believe, that was a matter of opinion. Emo Shuyao hugged Yili and lazily rubbed against her shoulder, saying, "Yili doesn't need to care about these trivial matters now. As long as baby Li is safely born, everything will be fine. Quickly get rid of this annoying brat. Then Yili would be his alone. Don't call him baby Emo. It doesn't sound nice." Yili seriously argued for her son's rights. Emo Shuyao indifferently changed his words. "Emo Xiaobao." Yili facepalmed and looked at the man's stubborn handsome face. She sighed, "Pet name." Emo Shuyao lightly snorted and didn't say anything. When the pet name was more famous than the official name, was there any difference between the official name and pet name? As a result, the handsome and famous future young master of the Prince Ding mansion had a pet name that he would never be able to get rid of in his entire life. When Qin Feng returned to the Chu capital this time, he didn't only bring back Yili's servants and chief steward Emo. He also brought back the Imperial Guard's deputy commander's beloved concubine and son. Xue Qingliang, who had been stubbornly refusing to say anything, couldn't hold back anymore when he saw the delicate and beautiful beloved concubine and the smart and adorable son who was 2 years old. He didn't even need to be punished. He directly confessed. In the dungeon, Emo Shuyao was still calmly and leisurely sitting on the large soft couch, coldly watching the family reunion in front of him. Feng Jiao and Qin Feng stood behind him and watched. After comforting his crying wife and son, Xue Qingliang stood up and said, "Prince, I can tell you whatever you want to know. But please, Prince, do not harm my wife and son no matter what." Emo Shuyao furrowed his brows and nodded, saying, "All right. I promise that as long as you tell me what I want to know, I will definitely not harm this mother and son. My body can give them a safe place to live." Xue Qingliang chuckled and said, "This one naturally trusts Prince Ding's personal promise. Prince, you can ask." Emo Shuyao waved his hand and had people take the mother and son away. The dungeon was quiet for a while before he asked, "Why did Emo Jingqi spend so much effort to save Su Zuodi?" Hearing this, not only was Xue Qingliang stunned, even Feng Jiao and Qin Feng couldn't help but be startled. Feng Jiao looked at Emo Shuyao and silently said in his heart, "Prince, don't tell me you still have feelings for that woman, Su Zuodi?" It was probably because Feng Jiao's expression was too explicit that Emo Shuyao coldly glanced at him. Feng Jiao instantly felt a chill run down his spine. He lightly coughed and adjusted his expression, looking at Xue Qingliang with a serious expression. Xue Qingliang was very surprised by this question. His expression changed as he looked at Emo Xuyao's cold and calm expression. After a moment of silence, he said, "The Emperor and Su Zuodi have known each other since they were young. When the Emperor just ascended the throne, he mentioned to Su Darren that he wanted to take Su Xiaojie into the palace as a concubine, but was rejected by Su Darren." Emo Shuyao raised his eyes and said indifferently, "You want to tell I that the Emperor still has feelings for Su Zuodi and that's why he sent so many people to save her?" Xue Qingliang was silent. He also understood how absurd this answer was. He had followed Emo Jingqi before he ascended the throne, so he naturally knew what kind of person he was. Even if Su Zuodi was 100 times more beautiful, Emo Jingqi wouldn't pay such a great price just for a beautiful woman. Thinking, Xue Qingliang asked, "What does Prince want to know?" Chapter 435. Emo Shuyao looked down at his slender fingers and said, "For example, the relationship between Su Zuodi and Tanjiji." Xue Qingliang frowned. Tanjiji suddenly appeared by the Emperor's side 10 years ago. The Emperor values his intelligence and sees him as a think tank. As for his relationship with Miss Su, I don't know, but they know each other. Tan Jiji's real identity is the orphan of the previous dynasty's imperial family. Or you can tell why Emojingchi trust him so much. This, Commander Shui doesn't know, right? Hearing this, Shui Qingliang's face changed. He stared at Emo Xiuyao in shock without realizing it. Emo Xiuyao gave a cold snort, his sword-like eyebrows slightly raised as he said coldly, Feng San, bring that child in for this prince. Shui Qingliang was startled as he hurriedly said, no. Prince, please let that child go. I'll tell you everything you want to know. Emo Xiuyao nodded with satisfaction. Very good, Suzuki is in Ai's hands. But in these 2 months, countless people have come. Tan Jiji wants to kill, the emperor wants to save. I don't know when a woman became so important. Maybe you can give Ai an answer? Shui Qingliang's face was as white as paper. He looked at the tightly shut prison door. His wife and son were outside. If he said anything wrong, they would be consigned to eternal damnation. Weakly closing his eyes, Shui Qingliang finally opened his mouth and said, I don't know much. I only remember that I took something from Miss Su under the emperor's orders and handed it to Tan Jiji. Emo Xiuyao narrowed his eyes. What is it? Shui Qingliang said, I don't know. It's just, the thing was taken from the Prince Ding mansion. After that, Tan Jiji went to the northern tribes alone. A month later, the previous Prince Ding and the Mahist army were defeated at the border of the northern tribes. So I guess, there is a connection. After saying this, Shui Qingliang fell to the ground as if he had lost all his strength. Although he wasn't a good person, he wasn't really a heartless and inhumane person. After the incident at the Prince Ding mansion, he had a vague feeling that these things would come back one day, but he did not expect that he would have to wait for 10 years. The prison cell was completely silent. Only the crackling of the burning firewood could be heard from time to time. Emo Xiuyao lowered his eyes as he sat on the soft couch. A few strands of silver hair hung by his ears, making it impossible for others to see his expression. However, Feng Jiao and Qin Feng, who were standing behind him, could clearly see a few strands of silver threads moving even though there was no wind. The powerful and oppressive pressure made the two of them unconsciously take a few steps back. Both of them turned their heads at the same time and saw a look of disbelief on each other's faces. After a long time, when the 3 people in the cell were almost out of breath, Emo Xiuyao said coldly, continue. Shui Qingliang's face was deathly pale. A trace of blood leaked out from the corner of his mouth. He did not think that Prince Ding's cultivation had already reached such a level. Just by using his inner strength, he was able to make him cough up blood. He shook his head and said, at the time I was only the emperor's personal guard, so I didn't know much. The reason why the emperor wanted to save Miss Su was because Miss Su seemed to have taken 2 things from the Prince Ding mansion. However, she only gave one to the emperor. The other is still in Miss Su's hands. As for the other things, I don't know. Prince. Feng Jiao carefully called out. The silent Emo Xiuyao was far more terrifying than when he was angry. Even though he knew logically that Emo Xiuyao would not do anything to them, but Feng Jiao sighed. He quietly clenched his slightly trembling fingers in his sleeves. Qin Feng, take Suzuki. I don't care what method you use. I don't care how you do it. Make her spit out the answer today. Qin Feng's heart trembled. He nodded and said, this subordinate obeys. Feng Jiao frowned with some worry. Prince, Suzuki's mouth is not ordinarily hard. What if, then let her die. Emo Xiuyao said angrily, if you can't get the answer, send out all the Qilin. Capture all of Emo Jingqi's trusted aides. I don't believe that no one else knows about this. This subordinate obeys. Qin Feng nodded. He turned around and ran out of the prison without looking back. Prince. Feng Jiao only felt a bitter taste in his throat. He did not know what to say. The news that Shui Qingliang spat out was really too shocking. Just as he was in a difficult situation, there was a series of footsteps outside the door. Then he heard Director Mo's joyful voice, Prince. Reporting to Prince, Wang Fei is about to give birth. Emo Xiuyao was stunned. He suddenly stood up. Feng Jiao only saw a white shadow flash in front of him. Emo Xiuyao's figure was already gone from the prison cell. Bang! The soft bed that was originally fine instantly exploded into pieces, turning into a pile of debris. Looking at the pile of debris in front of him and Shui Qingliang, who was covered in wounds from the splashing wood shavings, Feng Jiao said indifferently, Commander Shui can be at ease here. Wang Fei is about to give birth to a son. If Prince is in a good mood he may have a chance to live. Xue Qingliang smiled bitterly. He looked at Feng Jiao and said, "Thank you for your comfort, young Master Feng San. That year I had been panting for several years. I always felt that this day would come. I have no way to live. My wife and children are innocent. I only ask that Prince can let them live." Feng Jiao was silent. What Xue Qingliang had said was too shocking. Chapter 437. It was still Chief Steward Mo who said with joy, "The little Shitzi is exactly the same as Prince when he was born. The Prince Ding mansion finally has a descendant." His usually stern old face had a hint of a smile and affection. Standing in the middle, Ajin blinked and looked curiously at the little baby in the midwife's hands who had not opened his eyes. Su Qingyan asked in disbelief, "Chief Steward Mo, when the prince was born he was also like this? Red and wrinkled like a little monkey?" Chief Steward Mo said matter-of-factly, "A child born naturally is like this. After a few days he will open his eyes. When he opens his eyes he will naturally be a white and tender little baby." Feng Jiao looked enviously at the red baby and sighed, "It has only been 2 years, but the prince already has a son. It really makes one envious." Chief Steward Mo said with a smile, "Feng Sangongzi is the same age as the prince. If he had married earlier, I'm afraid the little master would have run away." Feng Jiao's eyes dimmed slightly. He said with a smile, "How could it be so easy? It is not easy to meet a suitable person like the prince and Wang Fei." Everyone laughed as they finished looking at the baby. They made way for Lu Tong to carry the baby in front of Mo Shuyao. He said with a smile, "Prince, look at the little Shitzi." Mo Shuyao glanced indifferently at the red and wrinkled little thing sleeping in the swaddling clothes. From his eyes to his expression, there was not a trace of disdain. He said faintly, "Ugly." Therefore, even though the little baby could not see, hear or remember, the Prince Ding Mansion's Shitzi Xiao Bao grew up to know that the first word his father said to him in this life was that he was ugly. The feud between father and son was settled at this moment. Glancing at his son, Mo Shuyao found that his legs were much better. He stood and asked, "Is Wang Fei well?" The midwife hurriedly said with a smile, "The birth of the little Shitzi was very smooth. Wang Fei did not suffer much. She's resting right now." In the midwife's view, Wang Fei's labor pains to the birth of her first child was only 4 hours. She really did not suffer much. But in Mo Xuyao's eyes things were different. He only knew that Lili was in pain for a few hours before giving birth to this ugly boy. He lightly snorted and said, "I will go and see Wang Fei." Then he flicked his sleeves and walked into the room. The midwife behind them couldn't help but sigh that the prince and Wang Fei were deeply in love. There weren't many men in the world who were busy visiting their wife instead of their newborn son. After confirming that his little nephew was not ugly, Su Qingyan happily continued to move forward. He carefully stretched out his finger and gently poked the baby's wrinkled little face. "Little nephew, I'm your uncle." Feng Jiao rolled his eyes and said, "Can he understand now?" As he spoke he was unwilling to be left out. Chapter 438. In the cold and dirty dungeon, Su Zuidi, who was lying on the ground, moved her body with some difficulty. The sound of firecrackers coming from outside made the entire dungeon seem even colder and gloomier. It also made her mind, which was already not very clear, even more confused. Was it the new year again? She had almost forgotten how long she had been locked up here. The only thing she could remember was that she had to survive. As long as she was alive she would have a chance to leave this place. As long as she was alive she could get everything she wanted. Sometimes she couldn't help but think that if she hadn't wanted so much in the past, would she have been able to peacefully be the second young madam of the Prince Ding Mansion? With Mo Xuyao's military exploits, she might have been able to become the wife of a great general or something. But she didn't just want those things. She, Su Zuidi, was extremely beautiful and talented. She was known as the #1 beauty in Dechu State. Why did she have to submit to those mediocre women? Survive, leave this place and get everything she wanted. Su Zuidi told herself this every day. Clang, the door to the dungeon was opened and Qin Feng walked in with a cold expression. Xue Jing and Lin Han were with him. The three of them didn't have good expressions. The little heir was about to be born and they couldn't go see the princess consort's newborn child first. Instead they had to interrogate this woman. It really didn't make them happy. Hearing the footsteps, Su Zuidi climbed up and sat on the ground. She turned her head to look at the three and smiled. Is it starting again? Her face, which was mostly covered by dirt, flashed with a mocking smile and a proud expression. So what if these people tortured her every day? They still couldn't do anything to her. Every time she saw their frustrated and angry expressions, a strange pleasure would rise in her heart. Qin Feng casually kicked away the debris in front of him. He looked at her coldly and sneered, "Do you really think that's all we have to deal with you? Let me tell you some good news. The princess consort just gave birth to the little heir. Right now Ryong City is very lively." A trace of jealousy flashed through Su Zuidi's eyes, but she remained silent. Qin Feng didn't mind and said lightly, "There's another piece of bad news. The prince has given the order that we must know the answer by today." Su Zuidi sneered, "I don't know what you're talking about." Qin Feng nodded without any surprise. "I knew you would say that, so the prince also gave the order. If you can't get an answer, then you can go to hell." "What did you say?" Su Zuidi was stunned as she stared at Qin Feng in disbelief. Qin Feng looked at the woman on the ground mockingly and sneered indifferently, "I forgot to tell you. 2 months ago we caught the deputy commander of the Imperial Guards, Xueqing Liang." Chapter 439. Yes, Commander. Su Zuidi's hands were tied to the wooden stake, and one of her wrists had a deep cut. Bright red blood dripped onto the ground, but the prison cell was quiet and there was no one else. She turned her head to look at the blood dripping out and she could only hear the sound of blood dripping. Gradually, Su Zuidi only felt something buzzing in her ears and Qin Feng's cold voice suddenly rang in her ears. The princess consort just gave birth, and Ryong City is bustling with noise and excitement. Bustling. Why couldn't she hear anything? Seeing more and more blood on the ground, she clearly felt her body begin to weaken, as if she could feel the blood flowing out of her pulse. She even felt that she would slowly die until the last drop of blood flowed out of her. "No. I don't want to die. Help. I want to see Emo Shuyao. I'll tell you everything." There was no one outside the door and Su Zuidi fearfully discovered that she really would die here. This fear made her panic even more and she even felt her blood flow faster. I'll tell you everything. Help. I don't want to die." Outside the door, Qin Feng's lips curled into a cold smile. "Wouldn't it have been better if you said so earlier? I thought she would be stubbornly refusing to say anything." Lin Han said, "It's probably because she knows she has nowhere to go this time. Even if she doesn't say anything, Xueqing Liang will. Before she was just relying on the fact that no one else knew." "Go and report to the prince." Although it was already the second night watch period, there were still people in the Prince Ding mansion who were awake. Emo Shuyao sat by the bed looking at the sleeping Yili, his expression gentle and calm. He raised his hand to gently caress the pale and beautiful face he had chosen, a trace of tenderness and warmth appearing in his eyes. Beside the bed, there was a small cradle covered in soft silk, and the baby was also sleeping soundly. Looking at the adult and child in front of him, Emo Shuyao didn't have the slightest hint of sleepiness in his eyes. He bent over to look at the baby in the cradle, and seeing that there was no one around, he couldn't help but reach out to pinch the baby's tender little face. Although he had been very careful to control his strength, the baby still pouted uncomfortably as if he was about to cry. Emo Shuyao quickly retracted his hand and sat up straight to look down at the baby in the cradle. From the looks of it, he was going to be a father. She remembered her father's strictness and love in the Prince Ding mansion. Every time he got into trouble, his father would punish him mercilessly, and his brother would plead for him. However, he knew that every time after he was punished, his father would secretly come to see him in the middle of the night and sigh helplessly. He had never thought that he would be a father one day, and when he found out that Lily was pregnant under such circumstances, one could imagine the anger in his heart. Therefore he had always felt that he did not like this child. However, the soft and warm feeling that filled his heart was completely different from the feeling he had for Lily. This was his son. Right now he needed his protection. When he grew up, he needed his guidance. Then he would grow up to be a man as tall as him. And don't fight with me for Lily, otherwise father will properly dote on you." Bending over, Emo Shuyao stared at the sleeping baby in the cradle as he warned. Yili opened her eyes in a daze and saw Emo Shuyao sitting by the bed with his head lowered as he said something to the baby. She couldn't help but laugh softly. Being discovered by his beloved wife, Emo Xiaoyao's face froze. He pretended that nothing had happened and sat back down on the bed as he softly said, "Why are you awake?" Yili saw that he hadn't even changed his clothes. It was clear that he hadn't slept at all. "Why aren't you resting?" Emo Xiaoyao pulled her into his embrace and said in a muffled voice, "I can't sleep." Yili sat up from his embrace and pushed the distance between them apart. She carefully looked at his expression and softly asked, "What's wrong? It can't be that you're too excited about the birth of the baby, right?" Emo Xiaoyao curled his lips in disgust as he glanced at the baby lying in the cradle. Yili helplessly smiled. From the moment the baby was born, he had already been looked down upon by his own father. If she didn't understand Emo Xiaoyao's personality and thoughts, Yili would have suspected that he hated his own child. This father and son. How would they get along in the future? "I saw that your expression wasn't right before, but I didn't have time to ask you. Did something happen?" Leaning against Emo Xiaoyao, Yili softly asked. Emo Xiaoyao raised a hand to ruffle Yili's half-falling hair. A cold light flashed in his eyes as he lightly said, "The matter of Tan Jiji and Su Zuidi that we were investigating before is about to be concluded." "Oh." Yili raised her head. Just by looking at Emo Xiaoyao's gloomy expression, she knew that this matter was very shocking. She lightly patted Emo Xiaoyao's hand and comforted him, "No matter what happens, we will always be together." Emo Xiaoyao was startled. He nodded and said, "I know. Prince, Commander Qin requests an audience." Outside, Qingyu, who was on night watch, reported in a low voice. Emo Xiaoyao nodded. He stood up and said to Yili, "I'll go take a look. Yili should rest first." Yili also knew that her body wasn't well right now. She nodded and thought for a moment before saying, "If Su Zuidi really wants to confess, there's no harm in having Elder Su listen." Emo Xiaoyao nodded. "I know. Don't worry about these things. Rest well." After helping Yili lie down and covering her with a blanket, Emo Xiaoyao turned and walked out. He glanced at Qingyu and Qingwan, who were waiting at the door, and said, "Take good care of the princess." Qingyu and Qingwan stood up and said, "Prince, please be at ease." In the empty room, Su Zuidi was sitting on a chair placed in the middle of the room. There wasn't even anyone in the room to watch over her. Right now, no one would be worried that she would escape or commit suicide. The large amount of blood she had just lost and the various tortures she had undergone in the past half-year, she didn't even have the strength to walk 100 steps out of this room. She had just been dragged away to be cleaned and changed into clean clothes. Su Zuidi looked at the clean clothes on her body, lost in thought. The dirty and gloomy prison life of the past half-year had almost made her forget what it was like to be clean. She could only constantly convince herself to forget in order to survive in that kind of environment. But now, she finally couldn't hold on any longer. When she felt her blood flowing out drop by drop, she finally realized how terrible death really was. If those people had come a little later, perhaps she would have already lost all her blood. From the moment she opened her mouth to beg for mercy, she had already lost. She definitely couldn't bear to let herself experience that slow and quiet death again. The door was opened from the outside and Emo Xiaoyao strolled in. Behind him were Qin Feng, Zhuo Jing and Feng Zhiyao. Emo Xiaoyao walked to the side and sat down. The others also took their seats one after another. Su Zuidi stared blankly at the white-haired man in front of her. The Emo Xiaoyao in front of her was dressed in white and had a head of white hair. His expression was calm and his eyes were indifferent, giving off a distant and cold feeling. This was completely different from the Emo Xiaoyao in Su Zuidi's memory. Xiaoyao. You're Xiaoyao? Why are you? Emo Xiaoyao frowned and impatiently glanced at Qin Feng. Qin Feng looked at Su Zuidi and said in a deep voice, "Miss Su, since you're willing to confess, then say it in front of Prince. It's the middle of the night and everyone doesn't have much time to waste." This did not benefit her at all. Su Zuidi was stunned and looked at Emo Xiaoyao, who seemed to be asleep. She sneered and raised her uninjured hand to point at Emo Xiaoyao. Why, do you have to ask him?" Feng Zhiyao raised his eyebrows and looked at Emo Xiaoyao. "Could it be that Prince Ding Mansion did something to let you down? Even so, this woman's revenge method was a little too cruel. No wonder she could last so long in Qin Feng's hands and not die." Su Zuidi chuckled and looked at Emo Xiaoyao with eyes full of resentment and inexplicable love and madness. "Let me down? No, he didn't let me down. But he also didn't let me down. I, Suzuki, am the #1 beauty and talent in Dachu State. There are many princes and princesses who admire me. But in his eyes, I'm just an engaged fiancé. Feng Jiao frowned. He and Emo Shuyao became close friends when they were young. He also saw how Emo Shuyao treated Suzuki. It really wasn't bad. The second young master of the Prince Ding mansion was famous in the capital. Many noble ladies threw themselves at him, but he never pretended to be nice. Only Suzuki, who was engaged, was very good to him and only close to her. So what was there for Suzuki to be dissatisfied with? Seeming to understand Feng Jiao's expression, Suzuki snorted and proudly said, "Even the Prince Ding mansion was very protective of me and obeyed me. But he, since I've already been engaged to him, he won't even agree to a small request." Her words made it seem like she was lowering herself to be engaged to Emo Shuyao. Looking at the man who was as cold as snow in front of her, Suzuki's eyes blurred and she said softly, "But it doesn't matter. I love him. Even if all the princes and princesses in the capital came to court me, I would only love Shuyao. But Shuyao, why won't you even agree to a small request? The regent dotes on you so much. As long as you beg him, he will definitely pass the position of Prince Ding to you. Emo Shuyao. He has no interest in marching and fighting. You clearly have more military achievements than him. Why do you want to give the position of Prince Ding to him? How can I only be the second young mistress of a small Prince Ding mansion for the rest of my life? Then how can I let those women step on my head? I love you so much, but you won't even do such a small request for me." The room was completely silent. Qin Feng and the other two looked at the woman sitting in the chair as if they had seen a ghost. With a few scars and a red and swollen face, coupled with the infatuation, gentleness and resentment, her twisted expression, it was clearly exceptionally sinister and terrifying. As if she had finally vented out all the grievances she had suffered for so many years, Suzuki seemed to be unable to control herself. She continued to blabber, "This is all your fault. If you had been Prince Ding back then, everything would have been fine. But I only carefully tested you and you actually gave me such a look and even reprimanded me. Emo Shuyao. This is all your fault. How can I let those ugly women step on my head and flaunt their prowess? Only I, Suzuki, should be a noble woman who is admired and envied by tens of thousands of people. You actually aren't willing to fight with Emo Shuyao. I'll help you. As long as Emo Shuyao dies, the position of Prince Ding will be yours and I will be Princess Ding. What's wrong with that? Why can't I help Emo Jingqi and Tanjiji?" The more she spoke, the more excited Suzuki became. The expression on her face also became crazier. She pointed at Emo Shuyao and laughed maniacally, "But why are you injured? Why are you disfigured? Why are you a cripple? Emo Shuyao, it's all your fault. Who asked you not to listen to me? Who asked you not to love me? If you loved me, you should have done everything I wanted to do for me, just like Han Mingyue." The first time I saw Han Mingyue, I knew he was a gullible fool. Sometimes I also wish that you were as gullible as him. Why won't you listen to me? Isn't it enough that I love you so much? If you listened to me, how could Emo Shuyao have died? It's all your fault. How could Emo Shuyao not have died? It's you who should have died. A white figure flashed across the room. In the blink of an eye, Emo Shuyao was already in front of Suzuki. A hand mercilessly choked her slender neck. His gaze was cold as he stared at the woman who was struggling with a twisted expression. "Who killed my brother?" Emo Shuyao asked coldly. Suzuki was choked by the choke and immediately couldn't breathe. She raised her hand and tried to pry Emo Shuyao's hand away. But with her strength, how could she be Emo Shuyao's opponent? After a while she started to roll her eyes. "Speak." Chapter 441. Emo Shuyao. Seeing that she was about to die, Suzuki suddenly let go. A large gust of air rushed in and Suzuki started coughing violently. "Who killed my big brother?" Emo Shuyao asked again. Emo Jingqi and the Lu family, as well as the northern tribes, southern Zhao and the emperor of Shiling's clan. Emo Shuyao did not die of illness. He was assassinated. Cough cough. Looking at Emo Shuyao in front of her, Suzuki did not dare to hide anything. And the regent. The regent was killed by the late emperor's scheme. But the regent also sent people to severely injure the late emperor before he died. So the late emperor died within 2 years. This is cough cough cough. This is what Emo Jingqi told me. Seeing that Emo Xiuyao was silent, Su Zuodi quickly said, "It's true. The late emperor had people poison the regent with drunken incense. It's a strange, colorless and tasteless poison. After being poisoned, there will be no abnormalities at first, but after 5 days the person will show signs of a serious illness and die without treatment. No matter how skilled the doctor is, he will not be able to find the cause of death." Feng Jiao, Qin Feng and Zhuo Jing looked at each other, their hearts trembling. Of course they knew what drunken incense was. It was rumored that it was one of the 3 most mysterious poisons in the world, along with Heaven Underworld and Red Beauty Withered Bones, that had been lost for thousands of years. But the fact that the regent's death was related to the late emperor was even more shocking than Emo Jingqi being related to Emo Xuan's death. The regent Emo Lufeng could be said to be a rare virtuous official. Before the late emperor ascended the throne, the Dechu state was not much better off than it was now. Xiling and the northern tribes were eyeing it covetously. At that time, Prince Ding, who was not yet 20 years old, single-handedly resisted the 2 armies of Xiling and the northern tribes. After that, he led the army to quell the rebellion. When the late emperor ascended the throne, Emo Lufeng, who was in his early 20s, was conferred the title of regent. Martial arts could pacify the country and literature could govern the country. Different from many regents who usurped power and bullied the young emperor, Emo Lufeng did his best to assist the previous emperor. After the previous emperor passed away, he took the initiative to resign from the position of regent. 20 years of harmony between the ruler and his subjects could be said to be a good story for all eternity. Now that Su Zuodi had revealed such a secret, how could it not be shocking? Was history really written to fool the world? Emo Xiuyao strolled back to his seat and sat down, deep in thought. Of course. The other two to Emo to ask, he said, Shue said you took 2 things from the Prince Ding mansion that year. Of that year you took two items to you to ask to Emo to ask. To ask. Where is of that thing of that? The expression on Su Zuodi's face froze, and her already ugly face became even scarier. To ask of emperor of. To say to of that to ask. To king to leave to the king state emperor of his. To his the to his. To ask. To his. What does it say? Su Zuodi said, the decree of Emperor Taizu is that the royal family of the Dechu state and the king state Ding will forever be brothers. If the future emperor goes against the grain and intends to harm the king state Ding, the prince of Ding can depose the emperor and appoint a new emperor. Everyone was shocked. It was such an important thing, no wonder Emo Jingqi had to save Su Zuodi. Where is it? Feng Jiao asked. With this thing, wasn't it Emo Jingqi, that bastard they were afraid of? Su Zuodi gritted her teeth and said, do you think I will tell you? Su Zuodi was not a fool. After revealing these things, this was her only life-saving talisman. Emo Xiuyao stood up and ordered in a calm voice, Qin Feng, get rid of her. After that he turned and walked out. Su Zuodi stared at Emo Xiuyao in disbelief and screamed, don't you want Emperor Taizu's imperial decree? Emo Xiuyao turned back and smiled coldly, if I want to kill Emo Jingqi, I can do it even without Emperor Taizu's decree. After that he didn't look at Su Zuodi, who was paralyzed on the ground, and walked out of the room. Outside the door in another room, Su Zhou, Han Mingyue, Han Mingxi, Lu Jingxian and others were all there, but their expressions were very different. Su Zhi's face was red and white, his lips and hands were trembling non-stop. It was obvious that he was very angry. Han Mingyue's face was pale, and even when Emo Xiuyao came out she acted as if she didn't see it. Lu Jingxian, Uncle Emo and others were angry and wanted to rush in and kill Su Zuodi immediately. The calmest one was Han Mingxi, but he also couldn't hide his shock. Elder Su can go in and see her. Emo Xiuyao said calmly. Su Zhi's throat made 2 gurgling sounds, and after a while he could barely speak. He forced a smile and said, I can teach her. This evil creature actually committed such a sin. How can I face the ancestors of the Su family? With a peewed sound, a mouthful of blood spurted out from Su Zhi's mouth, and his whole body collapsed. Han Mingxi, who was the closest and the most clear-headed, quickly stepped forward to support Su Zhi. Su Zhi said, this evil creature. Prince should deal with her. Seeing that Su Zhi had fainted, Emo Xiuyao was silent for a moment, then said, please Mr. Shen. Lu Jingxian wanted to say something, but Uncle Immerse secretly pulled him aside and said, "It's already late, it won't be too late to deal with the rest tomorrow. Besides, Princess Consort just gave birth to the little Shitsi. She will feel uneasy if she doesn't see the prince when she wakes up." Immerse Xiuyao nodded and said, "You all should also go back early." Seeing that Immerse Xiuyao had left, Lu Jingxian said angrily, "I still have something to say, Director Mo. How can you?" Director Immerse shook his head and said, "Let the prince rest first. Since the matter is already known, is there a need to be afraid of not being able to get revenge?" This kind of matter, even they were shocked when they heard it, not to mention how much of an impact it would have on the prince's heart. Prince's body wasn't good to begin with. If he collapsed because of this, then the gains wouldn't make up for the losses. Understanding that what Director Mo said was reasonable, Lu Jingxian fiercely glared at the wall in front of him and said in a rough voice, "Fine, there's still plenty of time in the future. I'm also going back." The people in the room quickly left. Han Mingyue stared blankly at the tightly shut door in front of him, but he couldn't move at all. He knew that in the room, perhaps Su Zuidi was slowly dying, but he couldn't make himself stand up and push open the door that wasn't locked at all. The first time I saw Han Mingyue, I knew that he was a gullible idiot. The first time, in the Peach Blossom Forest, the 14-year-old boy saw the 13-year-old girl in pink dancing to her words. "Is young Master Xiuyao's friend?" Zuidi greets young Master Mingyu. From then on she fell into a love barrier and couldn't break free. Early in the morning, hearing light footsteps outside, Yili opened her eyes. Looking sideways at the empty seat beside her, Immerse Xiuyao didn't come back last night. Qing Shuang came in with water. Seeing that Yili had woken up, she hurriedly put down the basin and carefully helped Yili sit up. Yili nodded and asked, "Prince didn't come back last night?" Qing Shuang nodded and said, "I heard from Qing Yu and Qing Wanjie that the prince rested in the study last night. Do you want this servant to invite the prince over? Mama has instructed that Wang Fei is going through confinement now and can't get out of bed." Yili shook her head and looked at herself helplessly. In this era, confinement was really unbearable, but she didn't intend to make things difficult for her body. Looking sideways at the little baby who was still sleeping soundly in the cradle, she couldn't help but smile. Why is baby still sleeping? Wei Mama came in with a bowl of porridge. Hearing this, she couldn't help but smile. Wang Fei is young and hasn't taken care of a child before, so you don't know. This newborn child eats and sleeps every day. The little Shitsi will grow faster if he sleeps more. Chapter 442. Yili smiled as she took the hot towel that Qing Shuang handed her to wipe her face and hands. She then used warm water to rinse her mouth before taking the porridge from Wei Wei and tasting it. The light and pleasant taste made Yili sigh in relief. "Have you arranged for the little Shitsi's wet nurses?" Wei Mama smiled and said, "We have prepared 4 wet nurses long ago. We know them well. Wang Fei, don't worry." Hearing this, Yili frowned slightly and said, "4 is too many. Leave 1 or 2 first. Other than feeding time, send the little Shitsi to me at other times." Wei Mama looked with some difficulty at Yili. Even though she was also Wang Fei's wet nurse, she approved of not letting the wet nurses get too close to the little Shitsi. Otherwise, when the little Shitsi grew up with the wet nurses, he would not be close to Wang Fei. But if Wang Fei personally took care of him, she was afraid that the prince would not be happy. Yili smiled faintly and said, "Let's do it this way. When the child is 1 year old, it will be about time to stop breastfeeding. At that time we can arrange for the wet nurses to go elsewhere." She did not plan for the wet nurses to raise the child, nor did she plan for a group of wet nurses and servant girls to surround the child. She did not want to raise a Jiao Baoyu in the future. Wei Mama reminded her in a small voice, "If Wang Fei personally takes care of the little Shitsi, the prince will not be happy." Yili smiled and said, "It's not a problem. Usually the wet nurse and Lin Mama will help me. When he grows up he won't need anyone to take care of him." Wei Mama finally agreed. She bent down to pick up the infant who was about to wake up and went to find the wet nurse to feed him. After finishing a bowl of porridge, Yili handed the bowl to Qing Xia, who was serving beside her, and asked, "Did anything happen last night?" Qing Shuang replied, "Elder Su, who was staying in Nanyuan last night, seemed to be ill. The prince asked Sir Shin and Dr. Lin to treat him. I heard that his illness is very serious." Qing Xia also nodded and said, "Prince hasn't gone out since he returned to his study last night. I heard that the person who delivered breakfast this morning was also stopped outside. Yili frowned and pondered for a moment before saying, Qing Shuang, go to the kitchen again and send a portion of breakfast to Prince. Tell him that I ordered it. Also ask Commander Qing to come over. Tell him I have something to ask him. Qing Shuang nodded and said, this servant will go now. Your subordinate, Qin Feng, requests an audience with your highness. Not long after, Qin Feng appeared outside the door and asked for an audience. Yili said softly, come in. Yili and Emo Xiuyao had never paid much attention to such formalities. Now that Yili couldn't go out, Qin Feng stood in front of the screen with the painting of a misty rain in the room and replied. Qin Feng also understood what Yili wanted to ask. Without waiting for Yili to ask in detail, he told her what happened last night in detail. This naturally included the treatment of Su Zuidi. Su Zuidi struggled for more than half a year, but in the end she still came to the end. But before she died, she still told him the whereabouts of the ancestors' decree. If Emo Xiuyao didn't want that thing, then Su Zuidi would not be his life-saving talisman, but a piece of waste paper. That thing was still in the Chu capital. Back then, Su Zuidi left in a hurry with the help of Han Mingyue, so she didn't have time to look for the thing she hid. What's more, that thing was more like a talisman that hastened her death. Hearing Qin Feng's words, Yili was also startled. Although after the incident with Tan Jiji, Yili had some guesses about this matter, but it was far from being as shocking as hearing it for herself. What's more, it also involved the life and death of the late emperor and the regent Emo Lufeng. It seemed that the imperial family had been trying to get rid of the Prince Ding mansion for a long time. Does the prince have any plans to deal with this matter? Yili asked. Qin Feng shook his head and said, the prince has been locked in the study since last night, and hasn't issued any orders. Yili nodded. This was undoubtedly the biggest impact on Emo Xiuyao, and he really needed time to think about it. It wasn't until noon that Emo Xiuyao came back with a tired body. Looking at his bloodshot eyes, Yili knew that he must have not slept all night. Sighing, she didn't allow him to say anything and said softly, sleep for a while first, we'll talk about it when you wake up. Emo Xiuyao was extremely tired. Earlier he was angry because of Xue Qingliang's confession, then he was tense because of Yili's labor, and last night he was shaken because of what Su Zuidi had revealed. If it wasn't for the fact that Emo Xiuyao had made great progress in his cultivation these past few years, he probably wouldn't have waited for Su Zuidi to finish speaking and would have killed her with his sword and led his troops to the capital. From yesterday morning until now, Emo Xiuyao hadn't closed his eyes. Too many things had happened today, how could he not be tired? Lying on his side on the bed, Emo Xiuyao glanced at Yili, who was tucking him in. After opening and closing his eyes a few times, he finally fell into a deep sleep. Looking down at the man who was sleeping restlessly, Yili could only sigh softly. Leaning against the headboard, she closed her eyes and thought about the Northwest. Now that the truth of what had happened that year was revealed, to be able to wake Emo Xiuyao up, the situation in the Northwest and Dechu state had changed. Yili didn't want to stop Emo Xiuyao from doing anything. Just like the Mahist army, Emo Xiuyao had been suppressed for too long. And the actions of the person in the Chu palace didn't make people believe that he was a good ruler who loved his people like his own children. Big brother. Father. Big brother. Big brother. Emo Xiuyao murmured in his sleep as if he had fallen into a terrifying dream. Yili remembered the meter of Su Zuidi that Qin Feng had mentioned, and her heart trembled. Gently patting the blanket on his body, she whispered, this isn't your fault, Xiuyao. Don't be afraid. It's not your fault, father, big brother. When Emo Xiuyao woke up, he heard Yili's soft laughter by his ear. Opening his eyes, Yili was sitting next to him, leaning against the bed. She was holding the baby in light purple swaddling clothes and playing with him. There was a soft and gentle smile on her beautiful face. Yili turned her head and saw Emo Xiuyao open his eyes. She couldn't help but smile and say, are you done? Look at the baby. Emo Xiuyao sat up and looked at the baby in the swaddling clothes. He was looking at the two of them with watery eyes. The red and wrinkled face from yesterday was much better. Even though it wasn't completely white and tender, it was still very different from the red little monkey from yesterday. Yili lovingly cradled the baby and gently rocked him. This child was really too good at sleeping. Other than when he was born, this was the first time she had seen him awake. The baby can't see right now. In a few days he will become more and more adorable. Emo Xiuyao silently watched as Yili played with the baby. Even though he felt that the little boy was particularly annoying, he didn't say anything. He only quietly watched as Yi Li's smile became more gentle and kind. His originally cold and hard expression couldn't help but soften. When the baby fell asleep again, Yi Li called for Wei Momo to carry him out. Turning her head to look at Emo Shuyao's side, she saw that his face was still somewhat gloomy and said softly, "Those things weren't your fault. Big brother won't blame you." Emo Shuyao was stunned. When he regained his senses, he finally understood what Yi Li was talking about. He raised his hand to ruffle the hair behind Yi Li's head and said with a dry voice, "Mother passed away not long after giving birth to me. Father was also busy with court affairs. Kibbe said that it was Big Brother who raised me since I was young. Originally, I wanted to wait for Big Brother to inherit the throne and then assist him wholeheartedly. For many generations, the Ding King's residence had only one heir. It was only in our generation that Big Brother and I were born. We brothers naturally had to work together. Furthermore, with my ability, even if I can't obtain any title, I can't just idle around in the Prince Ding mansion and be a hedonistic son of rich parents." Yi Li naturally knew this. Actually, Emo Shuan and Emo Shuyao were only 7 to 8 years apart. Yi Li could almost imagine the scene when Emo Shuan, who was only 7 to 8 years old, carried his newborn brother and guarded the cold and empty Prince Ding mansion. It was no wonder that the relationship between the two brothers was so good. In Emo Shuyao's heart, the position of Big Brother was not inferior to that of Father King Emo Lufeng. It was also because of this that Emo Shuyao, who was only in his teens, had already entered the battlefield. It was also to tell Father and Big Brother that even if he couldn't inherit the throne, he could still fulfill his ambitions and live a carefree life. Chapter 443. It's just that I underestimated that bitch Suzuki. If it wasn't for me. At that time, Suzuki had indeed mentioned the matter of the Prince Ding mansion's throne to him. At that time, he had fiercely reprimanded Suzuki and ordered her not to mention this matter again, and then put it to the back of his mind. At that time, he thought that with his relationship with his big brother, how could he be instigated by a woman, and even more so, he didn't think that Suzuki would have any tricks up her sleeve. But he didn't think that because of this he would plant a seed of disaster for the Prince Ding mansion and his big brother. Even he himself had to pay a heavy price. Yi Li sighed softly and comforted him softly, "Big brother won't blame you, Xiuyao. This isn't your fault." Since Emo Jingqi already had the intention to deal with the Prince Ding mansion and big brother, even if Suzuki didn't have that intention, she might have let them find other opportunities. Hugging Yi Li in his arms, Emo Xiuyao said hatefully, "Emo Jingqi. I will definitely make him suffer a fate worse than death." Yi Li smiled and patted his shoulder, softly saying, "No matter what you do, I and everyone in the Mahist army will support you." After resting for a while and seeing that Emo Shuyao had calmed down a lot, Yi Li asked, "Shuyao, do you have any plans in mind? Nowadays there are a lot of things happening in the Northwest. Recently there have been several generations of passers-by that have entered the Northwest. I'm afraid that the area around Hong Province has been turned upside down by those people. Unfortunately, these people didn't know that entering the Emperor Gaozu's mausoleum from the northwest was simply wishful thinking. Unless they forcefully dug up the mausoleum, even if Tanjiji came, he could only take a detour. Nowadays in the northwest, apart from the Mahist army, who would dare to dig up the mausoleum with great fanfare? Of course, the Mahist army wouldn't dig up the previous dynasty's Emperor Gaozu's mausoleum. Although the previous dynasty had already perished, the previous dynasty's Emperor Gaozu was still a great hero passed down to future generations. Moreover, digging up a grave, no matter whose grave it was, the reputation wouldn't be good. In any case, the imperial mausoleum was in the northwest, not too far from Ruyang City. Apart from Tanjiji and Dr. Lin, no one knew what was inside better than Yi Li. Since it's there, it couldn't run, she naturally wouldn't be in a hurry. Mo Shuyao sneered. Since Emo Jingqi is so impatient, this king naturally has to give him a big gift. I Xiu Xiuyao's the Emperor Gaozu's I Xiu 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 Tis Xiu's, Tis. Estes. Tis to T. S's St. S father. S father and you used to come to invite him's twos to invites twos to come. S of this master is Tis Yi. Yi Li thought for a moment and said, "Big brother is now in the northwest. As long as he receives the letter, he will come to see the child." However, it won't be so easy for grandfather and uncle to leave Yunzhou. Why don't I go there myself? No. Yili was pulled back into his arms. Mo Shuyao rested his chin on Yili's shoulder and said in a low voice, I will personally write a letter to the old man to discuss with him about Mr. Qingyun. You are not allowed to go anywhere. Yili raised her eyebrows. This was too domineering. Before Yili could speak, Mo Shuyao rubbed his chin. His domineering voice immediately became very aggrieved and careful. Yili, don't go. Don't leave me. A small arrow shot into Yili's heart. Her face darkened. When did this person become so shameless? Yili, you want to leave me again? Otherwise, I will go with you wherever you go, okay? I'm afraid. If something happens to you, I will throw Mo Xiaobao away and let him become an orphan without parents. He will wander around and not know his next meal. Yili couldn't help but reach out and pinch his waist. That is your son. What kind of deep hatred do you have for him? Mo Shuyao didn't care about this. He grimaced in pain but still didn't change his words. It was only when he saw Yili's slightly narrowed eyes that he reluctantly stopped and asked, Yili won't abandon me? Yili sighed and said, No, I'm just saying. You and the baby are both here. Where else can I go? Only then did Mo Shuyao hug Yili with satisfaction. If Master Qingyun didn't come in 2 years, he would secretly give Mo Xiaobao to him. Yili belonged to him and him alone. Looking at Mo Shuyao, who was lazily hugging her, Yili helplessly sighed in her heart. She picked up the previous topic and continued, You mean to say that you want to hold a big celebration for the baby's 1-month-old? Mo Shuyao smiled and said, The birth of Ai's heir should be held in a big way. Don't those people want to come to the northwest to search for treasures? Rather than having them come here in secret, why don't we invite them here in the open? I want to see what kind of imperial jade seal they can find. Even if there really was an imperial jade seal without his permission, he wanted to see who could take it away from the northwest. Chapter 444. Yili's heart skipped a beat. You're thinking of, Mo Shuyao gave a sinister smile. Isn't it said that the one who obtains the imperial jade seal will obtain the world? Then let's see who will be able to obtain the imperial jade seal and who will be able to obtain the world. Yili lowered her brows and pondered for a moment. If the imperial jade seal were to leak out from the Prince Ding mansion, it wouldn't be a good thing. I've got it. Thinking of the bright yellow silk that she had brought out from the imperial mausoleum, Yili suddenly smiled. Looking at Mo Shuyao, she said, I had forgotten that I had brought out a treasure map from the imperial mausoleum. The birth of the Ding kingdom's little heir had spread throughout the world in an extremely flamboyant manner in a short period of time. Furthermore, Prince Ding had decided to hold a 1-month-old banquet for the little heir, inviting all the influential and famous people of various countries. Adding on to the news that the imperial jade seal and the previous dynasty's treasure had appeared in the northwest, countless people had rushed to the northwest of Dechu state. Chu capital Su resident Su Qingyan looked at the letter in his hand with a surprised and happy expression. Even the hand that was holding the letter couldn't help but tremble. Su Qingbai sat at the side and looked at Su Hongyan's uncontrollable excitement. He couldn't help but ask curiously, Second uncle, did something happen on second brother's side? Su Qingyan handed over the letter and said, Li gave birth to a boy. After training outside for a long time, Su Qingbai was obviously much more mature than before. Hearing this news, he couldn't help but have a hint of joy on his lips. In the end, Su Hongyan carefully read the letter that he handed over and smiled. This is great. Grandfather will definitely be very happy when he hears this news. Su Hongyan nodded repeatedly. Last year, after Lear had met with danger and disappeared, his father's health had become extremely poor. It wasn't easy for him to get the news that Lear was safe and sound. Now that Lear had safely given birth to a son, his father would definitely be very happy when he heard this good news that he had become a great-grandfather. The housekeeper standing at the door looked at the old master and fourth young master who had lost their composure and reminded, Old master, fourth young master. The person who came to send you off is still waiting outside the door. Although he was also very happy that Miss Lear gave birth to a child, he still had to have the proper etiquette. He couldn't let the messenger wait there for nothing. Su Hongyan came back to his senses and nodded, Reward. No, quickly invite the person who delivered the letter in. This old master still has some things to ask him. The head steward responded and hurriedly went out to invite him. Not long after, a young man in ordinary clothes walked in. He cupped his hands and smiled at Su Hongyan. "Lord Su, fourth young master, long time no see." Su Hongyan was taken aback. Seeing the young man raise his head and reveal his handsome face under his slightly messy hair, he couldn't help but exclaim, "Young Master Feng-san?" The young man was none other than Feng Jiao, who was supposed to be in the northwest. Without waiting for Su Hongyan to invite him to take a seat, Feng Jiao walked to a chair at the side and slumped down. He let out a long sigh and complained, "In order to return before the news was sent back to the capital, this young master ran 3 fine horses to death along the way. I'm so tired." He had set out the day after the little heir was born and had only used 3 days to rush back to the capital. Compared to now, the news of the little heir's birth was still on the way. Su Hongyan was stunned and looked at Feng Jiao in a daze. It was Su Qingbai who asked, "Young Master Feng-san, other than the matter of cousin Li and little nephew, is there something else?" Feng Jiao jerked the corner of his mouth and forced out a smile, but it was more like a bitter smile. "If there's nothing else, how could the prince be willing to let me return to the capital to be carefree at this time?" Although returning to the capital might not be as easy as staying in the northwest, Su Hongyan also came back to his senses. Hearing Feng Jiao's words, he hurriedly asked, "Did something happen?" Feng Jiao didn't have time to ask for water. He grabbed a pot of herbal tea from the side and poured it into his mouth. Then he looked at Su Hongyan and said, "The prince and Wang Fei hope that official Su and fourth young master will leave the capital with me and head to the northwest." Su Hongyan's expression froze. He and Su Qingbai were the only members of the Su clan left in the capital. In other words, they were hostages of the court. Once they left without the emperor's permission, then the Su family and the imperial family would be completely at odds. Seeing Su Hongyan's expression, Feng Jiao knew that Su Hongyan was in a difficult position. He said in a heavy voice, "I won't hide it from official Su. The Prince Ding mansion and the court's relationship is irreversible. If official Su and fourth young master remain in the capital, I'm afraid it will be disadvantageous for you too." Su Hongyan frowned and said, "It's fine if we leave. There's only our family in the capital. But the Su clan has been in Yunzhou for 100 years. If the emperor wants to find trouble, where can't he find it?" Feng Jiao took out another letter and handed it over, saying, "This was written by the prince and Wang Fei. I have personally delivered the same letter to Mr. Qingyun in Yunzhou. But I have no time to stay in Yunzhou for long. Mr. Qingyun and Mr. Hongyu must have made a decision by now." Su Hongyu took the letter in confusion and opened it. He frowned and read it. Soon his expression changed greatly. His usually calm face was filled with anger. After a long time he said angrily, "Absurd. There's such a thing, the emperor actually. Truly." Slapping the letter on the table, Su Hongyan raised his head and stared at Feng Jiao, saying, "Third young master Feng, is the letter true?" Feng Jiao smiled bitterly and said, "Does official Su think this is something that can be casually made up?" Su Hongyan was speechless. Everything in the letter was shocking. Which one of them could be casually made up? But this kind of matter was too hard to believe. Su Qingbai looked at his clearly angry second uncle. He quietly stood and walked to the table to pick up the letter on the table. He didn't read it. Even though Su Qingbai felt that he was mentally prepared, he was still frightened. The people of the imperial family, were they really this crazy? At the same time, the young Su Qingbai was extremely disappointed and angry at the person on the dragon throne and the court. He looked down, folded the letter and gently put it back on the table. Su Qingbai laughed in a low voice and said, "Second uncle, for this, is it worth it?" His father had the talent to help the world but could not become an official. He could only stay in Lishan Academy to teach students. His second uncle was also a true talent, but for more than a decade he was forced to stay in the position of imperial censor and watch the intrigue in the court. The 5 brothers could only suppress their talents and temperaments. Yet how long would this suppression last? Their generation or until the Su family was destroyed. No wonder his eldest brother was not willing to become an official in court. He probably already saw that this kind of life would never end. Su Hongyan gritted his teeth and did not speak. But his tightly clenched hands made it clear that he also found it difficult to calm down. The Prince Ding mansion and the imperial family were of the same bloodline. For generations they worked hard for the Dichu state and still ended up like this. There was no need to talk about the Su family. In the Dechu state, the Su family had no other choice but to quietly die. Feng Jiao sat silently in the chair and looked at the two people in front of him. The Su family was not the only one bitterly disappointed by this matter. Even someone like Feng Jiao couldn't help but be filled with coldness and anger. Su Hongyan put away the letter and raised his head to look at Feng Jiao. Presumably, third young master Feng has other matters to attend to in the capital. Please allow me to consider for a few days before giving you a reply. Feng Jiao did indeed have many matters to attend to. He stood and nodded. Of course. After official Su has made a decision, you only need to have someone send a message to me. I still need to stay in the capital for a few more days. This matter is not urgent. I will take my leave now. Seeing Feng Jiao walk out, Su Hongyan frowned and said, Third young master Feng. Feng Jiao turned his head. Official Su has other orders? Chapter 445. Su Hongyan sighed and said, If it's convenient for young Master Feng-san, you should go back to the Feng clan and take a look. In the past year, Master Feng has come to the Fu several times to ask about you. How can there be an overnight grudge between father and son? You have to know that the son wants to raise his family, but the father can't wait. Feng Jiao clearly didn't expect Su Hongyan to talk to him about this and was surprised. When he heard the phrase want to raise his family but the father can't wait, his expression changed. The smile on his face was a bit bitter as he nodded and said, Many thanks for Great Master Su's reminder. He was the son of a concubine in the family and had never been valued by his father. When he was young he was almost kicked out of the family because of his unruly behavior. Last year, before he left with the army, he completely broke off relations with the family. The Feng clan had already publicly declared that the Feng clan and Feng Jiao had no relationship. Now where could he go to see? Qingqing Lane, which had changed its owner and courtesan, was still the most famous dance and music venue in the capital. However, the once famous young master Feng-san was no longer a guest of honor in Qingqing Lane. He could only secretly enter through the back door. He pushed open a remote room in the depths of the corridor. There was already someone waiting in the room. When the other person saw Feng Jiao push open the door and enter, he raised his head and smiled. Feng Jiao, it's rare to see you like this. It really leaves a deep impression. Young Master Feng-san had always been very ostentatious. Even on the battlefield he still wore a red brocade robe that was dazzling. However, right now he was wearing ordinary cotton clothes. Even his handsome face that made people raise their eyebrows had been modified a bit and became a bit mediocre. Feng Jiao gave a dissatisfied snort and looked at the cotton clothes on his body with disdain. That's why this young master doesn't like to do these shady things. It's really too unglamorous. You just went to the Su manor? The young man was the second young master of the Lung clan, General Murong's son-in-law, Lung Haoyu. Lung Haoyu now took over all of the properties and power of the Prince Ding mansion in the Dechu state. Normally he could only hide behind the scenes and not show off in front of people. The two most famous playful young masters of the Chu capital in the past had both disappeared without a trace. This made all the talented women of the Chu capital very disappointed. Feng Jiao nodded and said, There's no need to worry about the Su family. Lord Su and fourth young master Su are both smart people. What we need to do is more troublesome. How's the investigation going? Any news? Lung Haoyu shook his head helplessly. Mo Jingqi is extremely suspicious. The man in black walked out. His handsome peach blossom eyes looked at the woman in purple under the lamp with a complicated expression. The strange and somewhat familiar voice made the Empress stunned. When she saw the man in black's face she was completely stunned. She frowned and said, Why are you in the palace? Then she remembered that her exclamation just now might attract the guards and palace maids. She quickly went to the window and covered it. You don't have to worry. No one will come. The man in black was young Master Feng-san Feng Jiao. The Empress breathed a sigh of relief. Looking at the handsome young man in black, she couldn't help but sigh. She turned around and poured a cup of tea. She pointed to the chair on the side and said, Sit down and talk. Aren't you in the northwest? Why did you come back? Why are you in the palace? Feng Jiao looked at the blue and white teacup in front of him and said in a low voice, I came back on the order of the prince to do something. I also came to see you. Don't you welcome me? His voice suddenly became a little bitter. The Empress was stunned for a moment. She smiled and said, Why? Usually very few people I used to know come to see me. There are only so many people coming and going in the palace. Feng Jiao stared at her and asked, "How have you been these years?" The atmosphere in the hall was a little heavy. The Empress smiled faintly and said, "The Empress of a country, the mother of the world. What's wrong with that? Let's not talk about this. We haven't seen each other for many years." Feng Jiao said faintly, 12 years, 11 years and 6 months. The Empress' smile was a little forced. "I didn't expect you to remember so clearly." For a moment the two were speechless. Feng Jiao seriously looked at the woman in front of him. Everyone said that Su Zuidi was the #1 beauty in the Chu capital. But in Feng Jiao's eyes he never thought that Su Zuidi was that beautiful. In his eyes, the most beautiful woman was always the one who gently helped the 9-year-old girl who was pushed to the ground and beaten by her brothers. It was she who wiped the stains on his face and told him with a smile that if he didn't want to be bullied, he had to work hard to become strong. It was she who held his hand and secretly went to the Prince Ding mansion to ask Xu Yao to practice martial arts with him. It was also she who secretly sent people to give him medicine and money when he was sick and had no one to take care of him. From then on, in Feng Jiao's eyes, there was only that gentle and noble woman. Unfortunately, the distance between them was too far. He was the son of a concubine of a merchant family. Even if the Feng family was one of the 4 richest merchants in the Dechu state, they couldn't compare to a family of scholars, farmers, businessmen. And she was indeed the most noble daughter of the Duke Hua family. Chapter 446. The Empress felt a bit uncomfortable being stared at by him. They really had not seen each other for 12 years. The once immature and delicate youth had now grown into a handsome man. Even she had heard of young Master Feng San's reputation in the capital, even in the palace. He still remembered that year. On the night before her wedding it was raining heavily. That youth had dodged the heavy guards of the Hua country manor and arrived in front of her door. His face was filled with apprehension as he asked her, "Can you not marry Prince Qi?" When she shook her head, the young man's eyes, which were as bright as the stars, slowly turned dark and dull. At that time she did not understand the youth's thoughts. She only thought that he was reluctant to part with his older sister who had taken care of him again. But when she saw the youth glance at her with disappointment and dejectedly leave, she did not know why, but her heart felt heavy and she could not help but cry. Slowly she understood why the youth was disappointed, but they had already drifted apart. She was Prince Qi's wife and the Empress of Dechu State. He was still the Feng family's 3rd young master, but his youth was famous in the capital. In reality, perhaps it was best to never see each other. "Ayao, how have you been these years?" After a long time the Empress finally broke the silence. "Don't call me Ayao." Feng Jiao glared and growled. The Empress was surprised and suddenly remembered that she had also called the young Emo Shuyao Ayao. Although the characters were different, they all sounded the same. So every time she called him Ayao, he would always throw a tantrum. But it seemed that she could not find another name, so she continued to call him that. Thinking of this, the Empress couldn't help but smile. Feng Jiao clearly remembered the embarrassing events of his youth. His expression stiffened as he turned his face away. The light in the hall was a bit dim, so it was impossible to see if he was blushing. The Empress stood and said with a faint smile, "You're already this old, yet you're still throwing a tantrum? You didn't come to the palace so late just to see me. Is there something you need?" Feng Jiao looked at her beautiful face under the light and suddenly said, "Leave with me. Leave with me." Looking at the woman in front of him who was clearly frightened, Feng Jiao repeated in a deep voice. The Empress was shocked by his words. After a while she recovered and shook her head. A trace of anger rose in Feng Jiao's eyes. He gritted his teeth and said, "Why?" The Empress lowered her eyes, hiding the sadness in her eyes. She raised her eyes to look at Feng Jiao, but there was a faint smile on her face as she said, "I am the Emperor's wife, the Empress of Dechu State. Anyone can leave, but I can't." Although she didn't have the so-called love between a man and a woman towards Emo Jingqi, she didn't feel any dissatisfaction when the previous emperor appointed their marriage. Since that was the case, whether the future was good or bad, it had nothing to do with others. She and Emo Jingqi were husband and wife, and he was the father of her daughter. She didn't love him, but she had to accompany him. In the past she didn't understand Feng Jiao's thoughts. Now that she understood, she couldn't go with him. Taking away the Empress of Dechu state from the Dechu palace was not a good thing for Feng Jiao. Feng Jiao stared fiercely at the Empress' calm smile, almost biting his lips until they bled. The Empress looked at him and said in a quiet voice, "You're not young anymore. I heard that Princess Ding is already pregnant. You and Prince Ding are the same age, so you should have found a good girl to marry a long time ago. Yao Jieji thanks you for coming to see me. But don't come back in the future. The palace isn't a place where you can come and go as you please. It's not good for you or me." Feng Jiao suddenly stood up and stared at the imperial family. Good. It was my own unrequited love. I shouldn't have come to disturb the Empress' life. I'll leave now. Although he said this, his feet didn't move at all. Once he said this, Feng Jiao's heart was filled with regret. He knew that she only said this to chase him away, not because she was afraid he would bring trouble to her. The Empress sighed softly and said, "You really have a childish temper. Go back." Feng Jiao stared at the Empress and couldn't speak for a while. He wanted to tell the Empress what Mo Jingqi had done. He wanted to tell the Empress that Prince Ding definitely would not let go of Mo Jingqi. He wanted to beg her to leave with him. But he understood her. Even if she knew this, she would not leave with him. Because ever since she stepped onto the Qi Wang Fu's bridal sedan, her life's glory and disgrace were all tied to Mo Jingqi. Even if Mo Jingqi really became the ruler of a destroyed country, she would only accompany him to die for the country. Is it that no matter what Mo Jingqi does, you will not leave him? Feng Jiao said coldly. The Empress paused. She was a very intelligent woman. Hearing Feng Jiao say this, she understood that Mo Jingqi must have done something that he should not have done. A faint bitter smile rose to her lips and she said, "As the Empress, it is my fault that I cannot advise the Emperor. If something happens, I can only bear it with him. I'll leave. Don't come back. If there is a chance in the future, help me. Take care of Chang'e." Feng Jiao was silent. Although young Master Feng San was quick-witted and eloquent, he would never be a match for her. She only had to look at him indifferently and he would not be able to say anything. After a long silence, Feng Jiao nodded. Chapter 447. Leng Haoyu said, "Since Prince was able to walk again, I think many people think that Prince's poison has been cured. They don't pay as much attention to the Raging Flame Lotus as before. I've already arranged for people to retrieve the Raging Flame Lotus as soon as it matures." Feng Jiao nodded. Whether it's useful or not, it's always good to prepare more. If it's too late for the Sky Falling Flower, Mr. Shen will definitely think of a way with the Raging Flame Lotus. In fact, no one was too optimistic about the Sky Falling Flower. Not to mention the time and energy needed to find the Sky Falling Flower, the long-lost ancient prescription was also troublesome. Therefore, while Xin Yang was studying the Sky Falling Flower, he also focused on some prescriptions that could replace or temporarily restrain the poison in Prince's body. Leng Haoyu nodded seriously. Everything they were doing now was based on Prince Ding's health. If anything happened to Prince Ding, all their efforts would be in vain. This was also why the Mahist army temporarily occupied the entire northwest for so long, but the higher-ups of the Mahist army did not become more radical. Once something happened to the prince, the more they did now, the greater the blow to the Mahist army in the future. "Hey, let's do it. Just tell me how many experts you need." Leng Haoyu stood up and said. Feng Jiao only brought a part of the Shadow Guard and a dozen people from Qilin this time. Although they were all elites, there were too few of them. Feng Jiao raised his eyebrows and said with a smile, "Speaking of experts, the princess really gave me an expert before the king left. As long as he is obedient, it's not impossible to catch Mo Jingqi from the palace." Leng Haoyu asked curiously, "There's such an expert under the princess?" Feng Jiao smiled and said, "Mu Qingtsong, one of the 4 experts in the world. Plus Qilin, do you think it's enough?" Leng Haoyu was stunned for a moment, then he clapped his hands and said with a smile, "Enough, it's more than enough. One of the top 4 masters in the world plus the elusive Qilin. Unless Mo Jingqi's palace was impenetrable, there was no need to worry about not being able to drag him out of the palace." In the emperor's bedroom, Mo Jingqi walked in with a gloomy expression. The oppressive aura around him caused the eunuchs and palace maids behind him to lower their heads in fear, not daring to look at their master. Standing at the door, Mo Jingqi turned his head and swept a glance at the frightened crowd. He coldly and angrily said, All of you get out. Everyone sighed in relief and hurriedly retreated. In an instant, Emojingchi was the only one left in the palace. The resplendent bedchamber appeared empty and cold. Emojingchi stepped in and kicked over a small table with an antique vase. Then the other things in the hall were all messed up. The palace maids and eunuchs guarding outside could only hear the clattering sounds coming from inside and knew that the emperor was smashing things again. Eunuch. The new eunuch worriedly asked the eunuch in charge. Was it really okay for the emperor to be angry like this? The eunuch in charge was clearly used to this. He calmly said, "Guard it well. Don't ask what you shouldn't ask." Yes. The eunuch nodded as if he understood. Moshio. Hili. I will definitely kill you all. Inside the hall, Emojingchi, who had fiercely vented his anger, roared at the mess on the floor. Thinking of the news he received in the morning court, Emojingchi couldn't help but burn with anger. He even wanted to kill the person who delivered the letter. Yili gave birth to a child. Emo Shuyao actually dared to openly call him Prince Ding's heir. Prince Ding's position had long been removed by him. Emo Shuyao's actions were clearly going against him. He even openly sent out invitations to invite the nobles of various countries to Ruyang to attend Prince Ding's one-month-old celebration. It should be known that this was an honor that even the princes of Dechu state did not have. Emo Shuyao wanted to tell the world that his son was more honorable than Emo Shuyao's prince? Emo Shuyao. I didn't kill you back then. That's why I raised a tiger today. Just you wait. Reporting to your majesty, Prime Minister Lu requests an audience. Outside the door, the eunuch carefully reported. Emojingchi's eyes darkened. He coldly said, "Scram in." The door was pushed open from the outside and quickly closed. Prime Minister Lu also carefully walked in. After glancing at Emojingchi's face, he knelt down and said, "Your humble servant greets your majesty." Emojingchi coldly snorted and asked, "Prime Minister, what do you think of this morning's memorial?" Emojingchi didn't tell him to rise, so Prime Minister Lu didn't dare to rise. He raised his head and said with righteous indignation, "Your Majesty, Emo Shuyao's actions are really treacherous. Since last year, Emo Shuyao has done many treacherous things. His ambition is clear. Your Majesty has forgiven him many times, but he still does things his own way and is even more arrogant and reckless. Your Majesty, please punish him severely." Prime Minister Lu's words were obviously what Emojingchi wanted. He slightly trembled and nodded. "You may rise. Prime Minister, what do you think?" Prime Minister Lu thought for a moment and saluted. "Emo Shuyao is far away in the northwest. Even if your Majesty wants to punish him, I'm afraid it's beyond your reach. In my humble opinion, the Ding King's mansion in the capital should be immediately sealed up to show the public. In addition, the Su family in Yunzhou is the grandfather of the Ding King's mansion. They have a lot of dealings with the Ding King's mansion. Your Majesty, please issue an edict to immediately lock up the Su family in Yunzhou and confiscate their properties. Kill one as an example to others." Although Emojingchi also disliked the Su family for a long time, he still hesitated when it came to confiscating their properties. Prime Minister Lu hurriedly said, "Your Majesty, the Su family controls the most famous Lishan Academy in Dechu State. In every imperial examination, the number of candidates from Lishan Academy is even greater. Nearly half of the officials in the court are from Lishan Academy. Once the Su family defers to Emo Shuyao, these officials and scholars." Prime Minister Lu didn't finish his words, but the lingering sound was enough for Emojingchi to think. As expected, Emojingchi's expression changed. He nodded. "Prime Minister Lu is right. Let's leave this matter to you. Remember, don't let the people criticize you." Prime Minister Lu smiled. "Your Majesty, don't worry. The relationship between the Su family and Emo Shuyao is known to the world. Now that Emo Shuyao has acted against the Su family can't get away with it." Emojingchi nodded with satisfaction. "Very good. Prime Minister, you may leave." "Your Majesty, please excuse me." Seeing Prime Minister Lu leave, Emojingchi's mood was obviously much better. He couldn't wait to see what expression Emo Shuyao would have when he arrested the Su family. It was a pity that he couldn't see it in person. It was really a pity. As he was thinking, he suddenly felt a sharp pain in the back of his neck. Emojingchi's vision turned black, and he immediately fell into darkness. When Emojingchi came back to his senses, He found that he was not in the splendid bedchamber but in an empty room. There was nothing in the room, not even a piece of furniture except the chair he was sitting on. He couldn't tell where he was at all. But there was one thing that Immerse was sure of. He was kidnapped, and now he was definitely not in the imperial palace. Immerse's heart sank. He looked down at the rope that trapped him in the chair and struggled in vain. Guards! Someone come quickly. Who dares to be so bold? Come out. But if there's any problem with the item, Your Majesty knows the consequences. Immerse said dejectedly, we know. It was definitely not a small matter for the emperor of a country to go missing in the palace in broad daylight. Needless to say, the entire capital and the imperial palace were under martial law, searching door to door. Those in the palace who knew the inside story were even more alarmed. The Empress Dowager, who had long been enjoying her life in the imperial harem and did not care about worldly affairs, also came out. The Empress and noble consort Lu were also present. The commander of the imperial guards, the chief eunuch and Prime Minister Lu, who had been summoned by the emperor, all knelt on the ground. The Empress Dowager's face darkened as she angrily rebuked, "It's been half a day and the emperor has suddenly disappeared. What are you people doing? What's the use of the imperial family keeping you?" No one dared to refute and could only beg for mercy. Among them, Prime Minister Lu felt that he was the most innocent. He had only asked to see the emperor to discuss some matters. What did the emperor's disappearance have to do with him? It was only because he was the last person the emperor saw before he disappeared. Naturally, he couldn't escape being dry-cleaned. Investigate carefully for Ijia. You must bring the emperor back safely. As for your lives, wait until the emperor comes back. The Empress Dowager ordered coldly. Everyone nodded in agreement. After venting her anger, the Empress Dowager looked at Prime Minister Lu, who was kneeling on the ground, and asked, "Prime Minister, what did the emperor say to you when he last saw you?" Prime Minister Lu said, "Empress Dowager, they just discussed some affairs of the imperial court. There was nothing special." How could the Empress Dowager not see that Prime Minister Lu was perfunctory? Her eyes darkened as she said coldly, "Tell me the details." Prime Minister Lu hesitated for a moment and said, "Because of what happened in the morning court, the emperor was furious, but he didn't say anything important. He only said that they would discuss it tomorrow morning." It was not that Prime Minister Lu wanted to hide anything from the Empress Dowager, but the punishment of the Su family was top secret. As long as the emperor hadn't given an order, it couldn't be disclosed. Otherwise, the Lu family would be in trouble.